This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream. Last week, France cancelled a bilateral summit with Germany, with the Elysée citing difficulties on the agenda of some ministers. While this might not sound like massive news, the reason given is pretty implausible, and it follows months of building tensions between the two countries over energy and defence cooperation. So in this video, we're going to take a look at just why France and Germany have fallen out, what it means for Europe, and whether we can expect the relationship to improve in the future. So let's start by looking at what happened last week. Basically, for the last decade or so, the French and German cabinets have held bilateral ministerial councils at least once a year. The meeting this year, which was scheduled for Wednesday last week, was much anticipated. Not only was it going to be the first time that the two cabinets had met in person since 2019, but it was happening in the context of a European energy crisis and war on the continent. However, on Wednesday morning, the two sides abruptly declared that the meeting wouldn't be happening. Officially, both sides claimed that the meeting clashed with ministers' calendars, and there were reports that some of Scholz's ministers had complained that the meeting fell in the middle of the school holidays. As you'd expect, this was met with some confusion, because, well, it's pretty unusual to cancel a ministerial council so ministers can go on holiday. While this might have factored into their decision, what seems more likely is that the meeting was cancelled because France and Germany really aren't getting on with one another at the moment. There are basically two immediate areas of disagreement: energy and defence. Let's start with energy. As you might have noticed, the war in Ukraine and the subsequent disruption to European energy supplies has pushed energy to the top of Europe's political agenda. At the moment, there are basically two distinct but related concerns for European governments. First, how to keep domestic energy prices at affordable levels for the next couple of winters, and second, how to guarantee European energy security in the future. When it comes to keeping energy prices down this winter, there's been some dispute in Europe over whether this should be done at the national or European level. There are basically two arguments for a Europe-wide energy support package. First, coordinating a Europe-wide support package would be better at avoiding weird market distortions. For example, in late September, Germany announced a massive energy support package worth 200 billion euros, which will cap gas and electricity prices until 2024. This is great news for Germans, who can just keep using nearly as much energy as before, but bad news for everyone else, because this means less energy for the rest of Europe and therefore higher prices. Second, a Europe-wide package would, at least according to its proponents, be fairer, because some European countries just can't borrow as much as others. For example, when Germany announced its massive energy support package, the markets barely blinked. In fact, the day that package was announced, September the 29th, the yield on 10-year German bonds actually fell from about 2.3% to about 2%. Clearly, other European countries don't have as much fiscal space. Even the UK, which had a pretty good reputation in the bond markets, saw a spike in borrowing yields after it announced its energy support package, which was only worth about 80 billion euros. Now, in the British case, things were exacerbated by Truss's disastrous mini-budget, the Bank of England's aggressive quantitative tightening and pension funds derivative position. But the point here is that if the UK can't afford to borrow lots of money to keep the energy costs down, then smaller European countries, like, say, Latvia, definitely can't. And this feels a little unfair. Why should Latvians freeze just because the international markets don't like lending to them? The argument against a Europe-wide package is basically that it creates a moral hazard. If countries know that they can borrow money at the European level, then there's less incentive for them to keep their national finances in good shape. Because, well, they don't have to. Anyway, the French were a bit more sympathetic to a European-wide package than the Germans. Unlike the Germans, Macron backed a Europe-wide gas price cap. But they were especially annoyed by the fact that the Germans announced this massive energy package without notifying the French in advance. When it comes to guaranteeing European energy security in the future, the Germans and the French disagree on what sort of energy sources Europe should be using. They disagree over nuclear power. The French like it, the Germans don't, and the extent to which Europe should rely on natural gas as a so-called transition fuel. For example, France opposed the MidCat pipeline, which would essentially have connected France and therefore Germany to the gas pipeline network running from Algeria in northern Africa to Spain. Germany, Portugal and Spain were all in favour of the pipeline, but France considered it unnecessary, arguing that investing in gas infrastructure would only slow down the energy transition. Late last week, France agreed to replace MidCat with a new green energy corridor project, nicknamed Barmar, an undersea pipeline between Barcelona and Marseille, that will instead pump green hydrogen between the two countries. You get the idea. France didn't like the Germans' massive energy support package, and Germany doesn't like nuclear or France's opposition to gas infrastructure. This leads us on to the second thing they disagree on: defence. When it comes to defence, France is basically annoyed at Germany for sourcing its new defence equipment from abroad, especially from the US. For the past 5 years or so, Macron has been calling for European strategic autonomy, which essentially involves making Europe less reliant on the US, especially when it comes to defence. From Macron's perspective, the war in Ukraine essentially vindicated his position, because it proved that Europe can't take its security for granted, and the extent to which NATO still relies on the US. However, Scholz is apparently unconvinced, and while he recently committed to spending an extra 100 billion euros on the Bundeswehr over the next 5 years, it turns out most of that is going to be spent buying up American weapons systems instead of investing in Europe's domestic defence industry, which has irritated Macron. Similarly, Macron won't have been impressed with the new German-led European Sky Shield, which is basically a plan involving 15 NATO members, but not France, to buy a whole load of American and Israeli ground-based air defence systems. Again, Macron would have preferred that this money be invested in Europe's domestic defence industry. Anyway, you get the idea. France and Germany don't agree on how to deal with either Europe's energy or security crises. As a last thing, it's worth saying that these disagreements have probably been exacerbated by the fact that the balance of power in Europe has been shifting away from Germany over the past couple of years. Scholz doesn't command the political respect that Merkel did, and Germany's reckless reliance on Russian gas looks embarrassingly naive. Similarly, Germany's reluctance when it comes to arms shipments to Ukraine hasn't gone down well, especially in Eastern Europe, and its wariness when it comes to European debt sharing looks increasingly greedy, especially in times of crisis, and especially after that €200 billion energy bailout. We're not saying Germany is necessarily wrong here. There are good arguments against debt sharing, but the optics are becoming more difficult and patience in other European countries is wearing thin. Macron may well be irritated by the fact that Germany is still acting as if it calls the shots in Europe, when it's no longer clear that's true. Anyway, if that puts you in a bad mood, then this might cheer you up.
Last year, Team TLDR congregated for the first annual political pumpkin carving competition.
Each team member had 15 minutes to carve a random politician's face into a pumpkin, before the others had to guess who they'd carved.
Everyone was furious at last year's result, so we brought the game back from the dead for round 2.
This time though, we headed to Rory's farm in Essex to up the game.
This time it was also a lot more serious and a lot more competitive.
Who did we carve?
Who won the contest?
Find out in TLDR's second annual political pumpkin carving contest, exclusively on Nebula.
If you want to watch that video, along with a ton of other exclusive content, then head over to Nebula. That's the streaming service we made with a bunch of our creator friends, where we post exclusive explainers and fun videos, like our team attempting the British citizenship test, or our blooper reel.
On Wednesday, Peru's Prime Minister... Oh, God. I'm just going to ask next door, I'll be back. Turns out there's a bunch of useless next door.
Nebula viewers also get many of our videos before YouTube, as well as our content ad-free. If you do want to sign up, the best deal is with the Nebula Curiosity Stream deal. That way, if you sign up to Curiosity Stream, home to some of the best documentaries online, you'll also get Nebula absolutely free. That means 2 streaming services for less than $15 a year. Anyway, thanks for supporting the channel.